welcome to CEC Gurukul lecture. In continuation with the series on economic sociology, in today's discussion we will talk about Arjun Appadurai's book, edited book, The Social Life of Things. Now before we go into the details of this book, we need to understand what is the core argument. The core argument is that commodity value are not necessarily to be understood from an economic perspective. That is, they not necessarily have monetary or materialistic aspect, but they can be understood with reference to the cultural norms of the society. And number two, that much of the understanding of commodity, taking in from the perspective of Karl Marx, was to understand commodity from the production perspective. And here Appadurai is going to understand in terms of exchange, in terms of reciprocity, in terms of consumptions. So keeping these two main themes, we will understand the theory that Arjun Appadurai is putting through in the edited book, The Social Life of Things, Commodities in Cultural Perspective. This book was published in 1986. It is an edited volume. Now this work stands as a landmark interdisciplinary work forging connections between social history, cultural anthropology and economics. So this is also an important shift. So earlier much of the work was coming in either from economics or from a history or from anthropology. Arjun Appadurai's edited volume is trying to give us an interdisciplinary approach by connecting history, economics, anthropology and cultural perspective. So this book is basically the outcome of a collaborative dialogue between anthropologists, historians at the University of Pennsylvania in the early 1980s, and this collection marked a significant theoretical turn. It shifted anthropological attention towards material culture, consumption and the intricate ways in which economic life is culturally constructed. So this was the turning debate, that you move away from purely economic analysis where you're looking at commodity in terms of the value that it will get, and that value was a materialistic value. Now we move to the aspect of the culture and why it is connected to the geographical aspect, to the political domain, and therefore you have multiple dimensions to understand the value. It could be a geographical understanding, a political understanding, a cultural understanding. So here the core argument of the volume or the book is captured in the evocative assertion that commodities like person have social lives. So this statement is very important, that when we think about commodity, the first thing that comes to our mind is that it has a price, it has an exchange value. Now this statement completely turns it around and says that commodities like person have social life, and that is why it is kind of talking about the social life of things. This perspective possessed that the meaning people attribute to objects are not inherent but derive dynamically from human transactions, motivation and the specific way things are used and circulated within social context. And when we try to understand commodity, what comes in along with it is value, because every commodity has a value. Now whether it is a monetary value or a cultural value is what we need to understand. So value is, if we look at it from a cultural perspective, is not fixed. From an economic perspective, the value is fixed. Here when we talk about it as a thing or as having a social life, it does not have a fixed property as an object, but how do you then know the value? Now this value is culturally constructed in the process of economic exchange, and that is again going back to the concept of embeddedness. Now here Appadurai argues that the critical link between exchange and the creation of value is politics. Now this is understood in broad sense encompassing power relation, social control and cultural framework. To grasp this complex interplay, analysis must extend beyond the moment of production to encompass the entire life cycle trajectory and circulation of objects. So, this is again another shift. So, we are kind of hinting towards multiple shifts that is taking place within the anthropology. One is that it is moving away from material, economic to cultural value. Second, it is kind of talking about interdisciplinarity. And the third is that we need to understand commodity value not only at the place of production, but at the entire circle, that is from production to distribution to consumption. Now, this analytical focus necessitates a specific methodological stance, which Appadurai terms as methodological fetishism. This approach compels researchers to follow the things themselves, arguing that the meanings and social significance of objects are inscribed in their forms, their uses, and particularly their trajectory through different social contexts. It is by tracing these things in motion that human transactions, calculations, and social dynamics that animate them can be illuminated. Now, the methodology aims to uncover how value is made tangible, externalized, and pursued within specific cultural and historical setting. Now, each commodity does not have a fixed value. Now, this value is not only internal, but it is also external, and externalized in the sense that in the process of transaction, in the process of exchange, depending on the political, the economic, the geographical context, the value will shift, and that is what he is talking about, value in motion. So, there is also the aspect of cultural specificity, that from culture to culture, the value of a particular commodity will transform. So, when we talk about the methodology, here Arjun Appadurai is using this methodological point of view. He is giving us the example, the exchange of dowry leads to status and reputation gain, and dowry itself symbolizes pressure of caste, class, and gender relations. So, basically the whole idea is to commodify, the commodity becomes a fetish commodity, and they can be argued from different perspective or from different sides. You can have an argument. This approach challenges production, and as I already said, that understand commodity from a production perspective has been central to economics, and especially if we kind of refer to the argument or to the theory of Karl Marx or Marxian neoclassical economic. There the core argument was to understand the nature of value creation through the idea of production. So, we have in several lectures discussed about Marx's theory of commodity, where he is tracing it to the modes of production. Arjun Appadurai's cultural perspective talks about the creation of value through politically and culturally mediated exchange. Now, we kind of, before we go into the introduction of the chapter, which is by Arjun Appadurai, we talked about why is this work to be read as a part of economic sociology, and here the significance of the work can again be understood by looking into the significance that or the changes in the discipline that the volume is bringing forth. So, number one, importance is being in terms of doing cultural analysis of economic activities, bringing back the unitary relation between economy and culture, which has been the core theme in the work of classical anthropologists like Malinowski, Marcel Mauss, Douglas, and others. Now, the study of circulation of commodity is examined not only from economic perspective, but also from cultural and political dimension, thereby putting the focus of the idea that economy is not an isolated sector, but an integrated part of a social and cultural totality. So, what we describe as economy or what we describe as a market is not something which is only to do with the economic aspect, but the economy itself can be culturally defined. So, that is one of the important significance of this edited volume. The second is that this work kind of questions the dualism. Now, in a lot of neoclassical economic theory, a number of dualism exist. Dualism between, say, they are kind of considered as pole apart. So, we have a number of dichotomies that we read in classical texts, that is a dichotomy between gift and exchange, rationality, irrationality, industrial, pre-industrial, calculation, reciprocity. Now, all these dichotomies are based on a false distinction between economic logic and cultural define. So, if we look into the classical anthropological text, this economic logic and cultural design is also the part of the evolutionary theory, where the distinction is between the simple and the complex society, or between the advanced industrial society and the primitive or the so called pre-industrial society. So, these dichotomies kind of has continued into the literature, and much of these dualism are being questioned, and the reason that we need to discuss this work of Appadurai is that he rejects this dualism to assert that substantive explanations to economic phenomena cannot ignore the cultural dimension. So, this edited volume provides a revitalized anthropology of things, thus emphasizing interdisciplinarity. This is the third significance of the work. It provides discussions and debates between anthropologists, historians, and archaeologists, thereby overcoming the limitations of any one discipline. Now, we go into the core themes that is kind of running throughout the edited volume. So, the volume's core premise is captured in the evocative assertion: commodities like person have social lives, which can be traced in the trajectory as they flow through different contexts, changing form and acquiring new uses in the process of movement. This perspective persists that the meaning people attribute to objects are not inherent but derived dynamically from human transactions, motivations, and the specific ways things are used and circulated within social context. Value, therefore, is not a fixed property of an object but is generated through the process of economic exchange. Crucially, Appadurai argues that the critical link between exchange and the creation of value is politics, understood in a broad sense encompassing power relation, social control, and cultural framework. To grasp this complex interplay, analysis must extend beyond the moment of production to encompass the entire lifestyle, trajectory, and circulation of object. Now, when we kind of understand that the core theme is in terms of understanding value as a political creation in the process of exchange, we need to understand how do we define the commodity. And this commodity, as we have already discussed, is going to be beyond the conventional, often restrictive definition of the commodity. And what is the restrictive definition? Is to kind of close it within the production. Appadurai expresses dissatisfaction with the perspective that rigidity ties commodities exclusively to the institutional conditions of capitalism, a view often attributed to Marx, or that treats commodity as a fixed inherent category of certain types of things. The purest definition linked solely to capitalist production is deemed too narrow for comparative analysis, while looser definitions risk blurring the line between commodities, gifts, and other exchanged items. Appadurai proposes a shift in focus. Instead of asking what is a commodity, The more productive questions are, what kind of exchange is commodity exchange? And more fundamentally, under what situation do things take on the characteristic of a commodity? In developing this situational approach, Appadurai draws significantly on the work of George Simmel. Following Simmel, he argues that value is not intrinsic property of object but emerges from subjective judgments. Specifically, value arises from the perceived difficulty in acquiring desired object, the resistance they offer to possession, which is overcome through an economic exchange, a process inherently involving sacrifice. So, in general, what do we say is valuable? Something that we cannot kind of acquire, or in the sense that if we need to acquire that commodity which is valuable, we have to sacrifice some other. So, that is where the value of that product is emerging. Economic exchange therefore actively creates value. Appadurai extends this logic to propose a broader, more universal understanding of the commodity, viewing it not as a type of object confined to capitalist system, but as a potential state or phase in the social life of any object, regardless of its origin or the economic system in which it circulates. So, you have to have an overall understanding by looking into, say, life of an object in the sense where is it taking birth, how it is growing up, how it is kind of becoming distinct and so on. So, this leads to his core definition of a commodity situation. And what is commodity situation? It is a thing enters this situation when its exchangeability, past, present or future, for some other thing is its socially relevant features. This definition crucially foregrounds the social context and the potential for exchange as the defining characteristic rather than object's material nature, its mode of production or any inherent commodity essence. An object's status as a commodity is thus relational and contingent upon the specific social circumstances surrounding it. This concept captures the temporal dimension of the commodity situation and recognizes that things can and often do move in and out of the commodity state over the course of their social existence. An object might be produced for personal use, later become a commodity through sale, and perhaps eventually be withdrawn from the market to become an heirloom or a sacred object, thus exiting the commodity phase. This phase can vary in duration, being brief or long, and its trajectory can be reversible or terminal. For example, consumption or destruction. So, it is almost like a death of the commodity. That is why he is talking about the life. So, since it can be located in terms of its origin, its phases of growth and ultimately its end. This refers to the culturally specific standards and criteria that determine whether a particular thing is considered eligible or appropriate to enter the commodity situation in a given context. Commodity candidacy addresses the necessarily cultural process of making certain things as exchangeable while potentially excluding others. What qualifies as a potential commodity is not universal, but is defined by prevailing symbolic, classificatory and moral systems within a society. Through these concepts, that is commodity situation and commodity candidacy, Appadurai achieves a radical de-essentialization of the commodity. By defining it situationally and temporally, he creates a flexible analytical framework applicable across diverse culture and historical periods. This approach effectively dismantles the rigid dichotomy often drawn between gift economies, supposedly characteristic of non-Western, pre-capitalist society, and commodity economy associated with the West and capitalism. His focus on exchangeability as defining feature rather than the mode of production allows any object in principle to enter a commodity phase, thereby facilitating genuine cross-cultural comparison and challenging ethnocentric assumption about economic life. Furthermore, the notion of commodity candidacy underscores the boundary of the market and the sphere of commoditization are not natural or inevitable, but are actively constructed and contested through cultural norms and political process. So, how a commodity becomes of high value or it is of no value or it is kind of not considered as utilitarian is not only dependent on the market, it is not only dependent on how it is being exchanged, but it to a larger extent depends on the cultural norm, and that is the symbolic significance. If some object A or ABC is considered as sacred or is considered as more desirable, there is because of certain cultural norms and political processes. Appadurai elaborates on the commodity situation, a crucial analytical tool disaggregated into the commodity phase, commodity candidacy and commodity context. Value in Simmel's view as adopted by Appadurai is not intrinsic property of object, but rather a judgment made by subjects emerging from the tension between desire and the difficulty to acquire, a distance overcome through economic exchange, often conceptualized as exchange of sacrifices. Now, when we have tried to understand commodity situation, the idea of commodity context, he looks into the politics and geography of value. Appadurai provides a detailed examination of how political forces and social structure map the terrain upon which commodities move and acquire value. He elaborates on the idea that the circulation of good is rarely a free for all, but is instead channeled, contested, and imbued with meaning through political processes. Appadurai posits that commodities do not circulate in a vacuum or move randomly. Rather, their flows often adhere to socially regulated paths. These paths, which might be ethnographically exemplified by the concepts such as the Keda, path or road, or the Kula exchange system in Melanesia, and they are culturally defined and politically charged channels that reflect and reinforce existing social relationship, power structure, and cultural logic. The establishment and maintenance of these paths are in themselves political acts that determine which goods can move between whom and under what condition. This conceptualization directly challenges the idealized notion of a universally free and unencumbered market. It underscores that even in societies characterized by extensive exchange, the movement of commodities is frequently constrained, directed, and interpreted through the lens of cultural norms and political consideration. These paths often mirror pre-existing social maps of power, obligation, alliance, and status, making the geography of commodity flow a reflection of social and political landscape. So, when we try to understand the argument that Arjun Appadurai is making in his book, is a significant shift from understanding commodity and value from a non-economic and non-utilitarian purpose, where he brings in politics, geography, and the cultural dimension. With this, I come to an end of this lecture. Thank you.